Born in 1963 in Tacoma, Washington, Joseph Duncan grew up in a home riddled with dysfunction. His early years were marked by silence and secrets. As a child, he showed signs of disturbing behavior, hurting animals, peeping into neighbors' homes, and a fascination with control. Interview clip: fictional former neighbor, *, he was quiet. There was something behind his eyes. You just knew something was off. By age 15, Duncan was arrested for a violent sexual assault on a 9-year-old boy. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but prison didn't fix him. It forged a predator. After nearly 14 years behind bars, Joseph Duncan was released into a world that had long forgotten his crimes. But Duncan never forgot. He hadn't changed. He had evolved. What the public saw was a man who had completed rehabilitation, a model, barely. What they didn't see was the storm that had been brewing inside Heyman: obsession, a hunger, and a plan. In the years following his release, Duncan kept a low profile. He moved between different states, never staying in one place too long. Idaho, Montana, California. He worked odd jobs, lived in cheap motels, and maintained a spotless parole record. To his parole officers, he was cooperative and quiet. He even enrolled in college courses, studying computer science and psychology. But in reality, he was perfecting the art of manipulation. He was learning how to disappear in plain sight. From 1997 to 2005, strange disappearances began to surface along rural highways and secluded campgrounds in the American Northwest. The cases were scattered, often dismissed as isolated, unrelated tragedies. A child missing here, a family vanishing, their bodies burned beyond recognition, vehicles found abandoned deep in the woods. But the patterns were there, hidden beneath the surface. No forced entry, no robbery, no survivors. And in each case, someone, often a child, was simply gone. Duncan had become a predator on the move. He targeted quiet, off-the-grid towns, places where law enforcement was limited and neighbors didn't ask questions. He studied his victims, sometimes for days. He watched them from a distance, learning their routines. He would camp out nearby, blend in with the environment, wait for the right moment. His method was always swift, calculated, and cold. One such case occurred in the summer of 1999 in Lolo National Forest, Montana. A couple in their 30s and their 6-year-old son were camping off a remote trail. Other campers reported hearing screams late at night, followed by the sound of a car speeding away. When police arrived the next morning, the campsite was drenched in blood. The parents were found murdered inside the tent, stab wounds to the neck and chest. But their son was gone, vanished. No ransom note, no clues. Just an empty sleeping bag and drag marks in the dirt. 2 years later, in a small trailer park outside Redding, California, a family of 4 was discovered brutally murdered. The father had been shot execution style in the living room. The mother was found bound and gagged in the bathroom, her body mutilated. The 2 children, ages 9 and 11, were missing. Days later, their partially decomposed bodies were discovered over 100 miles away, dumped in a dry creek bed. Investigators at the time believed it was a drug-related killing. Duncan's name was never mentioned. What made Duncan so terrifying wasn't just the brutality, was the randomness. There was no obvious motive, no financial gain, no personal connection to the victims. He killed because he wanted to. He traveled across state lines to avoid detection. He left no fingerprints, no DNA, no trace of himself. He became the ghost story parents told their children. Except this story was real. Some survivors from these towns later came forward with chilling accounts. A hunter in Central Oregon claimed he saw a man watching him through binoculars from a nearby hilltop. A waitress in Idaho remembered a quiet, well-dressed man sitting in her diner for hours, staring at a family with young kids. A gas station clerk in Spokane recalled a man buying duct tape, gloves, and rope late one night, smiling the entire time. Duncan's path was erratic, but his purpose was not. He believed he was smarter than the system, and for a time, he was. Police departments across different states failed to connect the dots. No shared database, no communication. He exploited the cracks in the system with precision. Behind the scenes, Duncan documented everything. He kept journals hundreds of pages long describing his thoughts, fantasies, and experiences. He wrote about the thrill of the hunt, the power he felt, and the fear in his victims' eyes. He called his journey a spiritual mission. In his mind, he wasn't a criminal. He was an artist. The FBI wouldn't begin linking these murders until much later when the puzzle started to take shape. But by then, the damage was done. Families were shattered, lives lost, and Joseph Edward Duncan had transformed from a troubled teenager into something much darker. He wasn't just a killer. He was a drifter, a phantom, a force of chaos sweeping quietly through the back roads of America, and the worst was still to come. In May of 2005, the horror that had drifted quietly from state to state finally erupted into the public eye with a case that would leave the nation stunned. It began in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a peaceful community known for its lake views, pine forests, and quiet neighborhoods. But that peace was shattered on the night of May 16th, when authorities were called to a grisly crime scene at a small rural home. Inside the Grain family residence, officers found three bodies: Brenda Grain, her boyfriend Mark Mackenzie, and Brenda's 13-year-old son, Slade, all bound, bludgeoned, and left to rot. But what disturbed investigators even more than the brutal murders was the fact that two family members were missing: 8-year-old Shasta Grain and her 9-year-old brother, Dylan. The house showed no signs of forced entry. The crime was clean, deliberate. It was as if someone had entered, carried out a massacre, and vanished with the children into thin air. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt. Billboards were erected. Amber Alerts flooded the news. Every tip, every suspicious sighting was pursued with urgency. Days turned into weeks, and hope began to fade. No ransom note ever came. No demands. Just silence. What authorities didn't know was that Joseph Edward Duncan was already far from the scene. He had stalked the Grain family for days before the murders. From his vantage point in the woods behind their home, he watched them eat dinner, play in the yard, and tuck their children into bed. To him, it wasn't just surveillance. It was preparation. He was selecting his victims like a director casts roles in a film, and when he finally acted, it was with terrifying precision. For 6 weeks, Duncan held Shasta and Dylan captive in a remote cabin near the Montana border. During that time, he subjected them to unimaginable abuse, both physical and psychological. He kept a camcorder nearby, recording the torment, turning the children's suffering into twisted trophies. But what was most chilling was how he interacted with them. He wasn't a frenzied monster. He was calm, almost paternal, like he believed he was teaching them something. He cooked meals, played games, read to them, and then he tortured them. Duncan wrote about it all in his journal. He referred to the children as gifts and claimed he was rescuing them from a life of mediocrity. He believed he was freeing their souls through pain, guiding them into what he called the next reality. In one entry, he wrote, "Children are pure. They deserve to be unchained before society poisons them." That journal, later recovered by the FBI, offered a window into the mind of a killer who saw himself not as evil but as enlightened. As the weeks dragged on, Duncan began to grow reckless. He abandoned the cabin and began traveling with the children, checking into motels under fake names. In his twisted mind, he believed he had formed a bond with Shasta. She was quiet, composed, eerily observant for her age. She never fought, never screamed. She was surviving. Observers would later say that this calm likely saved her life. On July 2, 2005, nearly 7 weeks after the Grain family was slaughtered, a miracle happened. Duncan, convinced that no one recognized him, walked into a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene, just a few miles from where it all began. He sat down with Shasta, ordered breakfast, and pretended to be her father. But something wasn't right. The staff noticed the girl looked scared, pale, and thin. A sharp-eyed waitress thought she recognized her from the news. She stalled the order and quietly called 911. When police arrived minutes later, they confirmed the unbelievable. Shasta Grain was alive. Duncan was arrested without incident. In his backpack, they found handcuffs, knives, a stolen revolver, and a laptop containing disturbing videos of the children's captivity. Under questioning, Duncan remained eerily composed. He admitted to the Grain murders, the abduction, and to killing Dylan, whom he shot in the head just days before returning. With Shasta, the boy's body was found buried in the Montana wilderness. The arrest sent shockwaves through the country. For the first time, law enforcement had a living witness, an 8-year-old girl who had faced death and survived. But what made Shasta's survival even more extraordinary was that she remembered everything. Her testimony would not only help convict Duncan, but open the door to connecting him to multiple other unsolved cases across the U.S. And yet, the question lingered: why return? Why take such a risk, walking into a public restaurant with a child everyone was looking for? Some believe Duncan's arrogance had finally consumed him. Others think he wanted to be caught, that he wanted his story to be told. Whatever the reason, his capture marked the beginning of the end for the Boogeyman. After his arrest, Joseph Edward Duncan was transported to a maximum security facility in Boise, Idaho. His demeanor was calm, almost detached. He answered questions, but never offered more than necessary. He waived his right to a trial and chose to plead guilty to all charges, multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and child abuse. To those who observed him, it was chilling how little emotion he displayed. Not guilt, not anger, just a quiet, methodical certainty. For the prosecutors and the public, it was clear they weren't dealing with someone who lost control. They were dealing with someone who had never needed control. Duncan wasn't just a killer, he was something far more dangerous. A self-aware predator. As the FBI and local law enforcement dug deeper, they discovered something they hadn't expected. Duncan had kept journals, thousands of pages, handwritten, in spiral notebooks. Inside were meticulous notes on his thoughts, fantasies, and detailed descriptions of his crimes. He documented everything. He wrote about his early impulses as a child, the planning stages of each attack, the psychological manipulation of his victims, and the emotional high he felt from committing murder. One entry read, "I don't kill because I'm angry. I kill because I want to experience truth. And the truth is, we're all animals. I just stopped pretending otherwise." Psychologists were brought in to evaluate him. One doctor described Duncan as calmly psychotic, a man who lacked remorse not because he was unaware of his actions, but because he rejected the very idea of morality. In interviews, Duncan described himself as an evolved being, someone who had shed the artificial constraints of society. He told one profiler, "Pain is the only honest feeling left. Everything else is just acting." He believed that by inflicting suffering, especially on children, he was cutting through the illusion of humanity. He called it liberation. Perhaps most disturbing was how Duncan saw his victims not as people, but as characters in a story he was writing. He had an almost cinematic view of his crimes. He recorded many of them with a camcorder, narrating the events as if he were directing a horror film. He gave himself a name, the Boogeyman, not as a joke, but as an identity. In one video, after harming one of his victims, he looks directly into the camera and says, "This is what happens when you leave your windows unlocked. The Boogeyman comes in, and you never wake up the same." Agents reviewing the footage were visibly shaken. Some had to take psychological leave after watching the videos. What stood out wasn't just the violence, it was Duncan's ability to switch between calm and cruelty in an instant. One moment, he would be comforting a child, offering food or a blanket. The next, he would be executing one of them with a chilling lack of emotion. He wasn't simply acting on impulse, he was choreographing fear. During one interrogation session, Duncan admitted to crimes no one had linked him to. He spoke of a family he had killed in Northern California, another in Utah, and a girl he had taken from a campground in Oregon back in the late 90s. He said there were many more, but refused to give names or locations. When pressed, he smiled and said, "You'll find them when you're ready." The FBI launched a special task force to re-examine cold cases that matched Duncan's methods. Some cases were decades old. Others had been sitting unsolved for years, dismissed as isolated events. Duncan's confessions gave new life to these investigations. Parents who had gone years without answers suddenly found themselves revisiting their worst nightmares. But Duncan seemed to enjoy that. He knew he had power over the living, even behind bars. In interviews with prison staff, guards described Duncan as polite, quiet, and never disruptive. He read books constantly, religion, even poetry. He refused medication, refused therapy, and refused to acknowledge his own diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. He believed there was nothing wrong with him. The world, he said, was the problem. Despite his guilty plea, prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, citing the sheer brutality and premeditation of his crimes. In court, Duncan remained emotionless, even as family members of the victims broke down, reading their statements. When the judge read out the sentence, death by lethal injection, Duncan simply nodded once, like a man acknowledging a traffic fine. There was no apology, no final statement, just silence. It was that silence that haunted so many, because Joseph Edward Duncan wasn't a man who lashed out in rage. He was a man who waited, planned, and executed. A man who believed he was smarter than everyone else. And for a long time, he was. But what terrified people most wasn't what Duncan had done, it was what he never said. The stories he hadn't told. The victims he hadn't named. The places he hadn't marked on a map. Joseph Edward Duncan had pulled back the curtain on the worst kind of evil. The kind that believes it's doing the right thing. By the time Joseph Edward Duncan stood before a federal court, the nation already knew his name. His crimes had dominated headlines for months, and his chilling lack of remorse only deepened public outrage. Duncan faced 10 counts of murder, multiple federal charges related to kidnapping and sexual abuse, and violations of parole that had allowed him to commit his most horrific crimes. Yet, through it all, he sat in the courtroom as if he were a passive observer at someone else's trial, expressionless, silent, almost bored. In the eyes of many, he wasn't on trial for what he did. He was the living embodiment of evil, and the court was simply formalizing what everyone already believed, that he deserved to die. The prosecution opened with a brutal timeline of events, laying out each murder in excruciating detail. The images of the Graham family crime scene were too graphic to be shown publicly, but they were presented to the jury photographs of blood-soaked mattresses, shattered furniture, and the crude restraints used on the victims. FBI agents testified about the videos Duncan had recorded, describing them as some of the most disturbing material they had ever encountered. One seasoned agent broke down on the stand, unable to finish his description of a video in which Duncan forced the children to speak into the camera while he hurt them. The defense, meanwhile, didn't argue for innocence. Instead, they painted a picture of a man born into abuse, shaped by trauma, and failed by the criminal justice system. They argued that Duncan had been mentally ill for decades, and that his repeated cries for help had gone unanswered. Court records revealed that Duncan himself had asked to remain in prison after his early release, warning authorities that he would kill again if set free. The request was denied. To many, this detail was perhaps the most haunting of all. The system had been warned and it had let him go anyway. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a place of unbearable tension. The Grain family members sat only feet away from the man who had destroyed their lives. Shasta, now under protection and surrounded by counselors, did not attend the trial, but her pre-recorded testimony was played for the jury, a quiet, tearful account of survival that left the courtroom in silence. Her voice was small, but her words carried enormous weight. She spoke of fear, of pretending to be brave, of the night Duncan killed her brother, Dylan. He told me, she said, that Dylan was going away, and I knew what that meant. Duncan never looked away during the recording. He watched, unflinching, as the child he had tormented told the world what he had done. When the video ended, there was no response from him. No apology, no emotion. Just that same empty stare that had followed him from his arrest to the courtroom. His only words throughout the trial came during a brief statement to the judge. He said, "I did what I did. I won't pretend to be sorry. I only wish I had more time to finish what I started." It was the final straw. The jury took less than 4 hours to deliberate. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Duncan showed no reaction. During sentencing, the judge addressed him directly, calling him a predator, a manipulator, and the closest thing to pure evil the court had ever seen. Then came the announcement: Joseph Edward Duncan would be sentenced to death by lethal injection. But even as the sentence was delivered, questions lingered. How many more victims were out there? How many cold cases could be connected to him? In the weeks following the trial, law enforcement from multiple states submitted old files to the FBI for review: unsolved child abductions, unexplained family murders, missing persons reports from rural areas across the Northwest. Duncan had hinted at more victims. He had even claimed, in passing, that bodies were still waiting to be found. But he refused to elaborate. He enjoyed the silence, the not. He knew that long after he was gone, investigators would still be chasing his shadow. Duncan was transferred to a federal death row facility in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he would remain isolated for the rest of his life. There, he was kept in solitary confinement, allowed outside only 1 hour per day. He rarely spoke to anyone. He stopped keeping journals. He stopped writing letters. It was as if, once he had told his story, he no longer needed to exist in the world. But his case had already changed things. It sparked a national conversation about early release programs, the parole system, and the failures of mental health evaluations within prisons. His crimes led to sweeping reforms in how sex offenders were tracked after release, and how digital forensics were used in child exploitation cases. The horror he left behind became fuel for systemic change. Still, for many, it wasn't enough. No law could bring back the dead. No policy could undo what Joseph Duncan had done. The trial had ended. The sentence was final. But the legacy of the Boogeyman was just beginning to take shape in nightmares, in cold case files, and in the uneasy truth that monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes, they wear polite smiles and wait for the night to fall. Joseph Edward Duncan spent his final years alone in a concrete cell, monitored 24 hours a day, with nothing but a steel bed, a sink, a toilet, and a slit of window that offered no view. On the outside, time moved forward. Laws were passed. Victims. Families tried to rebuild. But behind those walls, Duncan existed in suspended silence. He rarely spoke to guards or fellow inmates. He refused therapy. He refused religious counsel. It was as if he was waiting for what no one knew. In 2020, that waiting came to an abrupt end when prison doctors diagnosed Duncan with terminal brain cancer. The disease had already begun to affect his motor functions. His speech slowed. His coordination faltered. He was transferred from death row to the prison infirmary, where he would spend his last months under medical care he neither wanted nor asked for. News of his illness quickly reached the families of his victims. For some, it brought a grim sense of justice, knowing he would suffer. For others, it was a bitter disappointment. They had waited for years to see him face the execution chamber. Now death would come on its own terms. Duncan died on March 28, 2021, at the age of 58. There were no last words, no final confessions, just a flat line on a heart monitor and a formal announcement from the Bureau of Prisons. His body was cremated. No one claimed his remains. No funeral was held. No one mourned. For a man who had once demanded the world's attention, he died in complete obscurity. But his story, his darkness didn't die with him. In the aftermath of his death, FBI agents continued to investigate unsolved cases potentially linked to Duncan. With advancements in forensic technology, especially genetic genealogy and digital cross-referencing, several cold cases began to re-emerge. A family murdered in a Utah campground in 1998, a 10-year-old girl who vanished from a church parking lot in Spokane in 2001, a double homicide in a remote Idaho trailer park, all previously disconnected, all now under fresh scrutiny. Duncan had hinted at these crimes in vague journal entries, often referring to them as successful rehearsals or silent exits. No names, no locations, just cryptic lines that read like riddles. Despite public pressure, most of these cases remain unsolved. Duncan took those secrets to the grave. It's likely he wanted it that way. His legacy was never just about killing. It was about power. And the greatest power of all in his eyes was control over truth. By withholding confessions, by leaving questions unanswered, he ensured that his name would haunt law enforcement long after his body turned to Ashdod to this day. There are still detectives, retired and active, who remember the Duncan case with a heavy heart, not because he was the most prolific killer. There have been worse, but because he represented something uniquely terrifying. A man who was both extraordinarily intelligent and utterly devoid of empathy. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't irrational. He was methodical, self-aware, and completely committed to his own twisted logic. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and books have kept the story alive. The Boogeyman, as he called himself, became a kind of cautionary symbol. Parents used his name to scare their children into locking doors. Schools used his case in safety seminars. His face became one of those images people couldn't forget, no matter how hard they tried. Not because of what he looked like, but because of what he represented. That the worst monsters are the ones who know exactly what they're doing. Shasta Grain, the lone survivor of his most publicized crime, grew up and eventually gave a rare interview in her 20s. In it, she didn't speak much about the details of her captivity. Instead, she focused on survival and what it meant to carry the weight of that experience and still move forward. She said, "I didn't survive so I could be scared forever. I survived so I could live. He took everything from me, but I'm still here. That's what he doesn't get to have." Her words became a symbol of defiance in the face of unthinkable horror. The Duncan case also served as a catalyst for change. Several states re-examined their parole policies, particularly for violent sex offenders. The National Sex Offender Registry was overhauled, and funding was increased for task forces dealing with internet-based child exploitation. Duncan had shown how easily someone could exploit the gaps in the system. In response, those gaps began too close. But no system is perfect. No law can stop the evil that festers in silence. Duncan may be gone, but the fear he created still lingers in remote campsites, in unlocked homes, in dark highways where headlights disappear into the void. He left behind more than victims. He left behind a scar on the American conscience. Reminder that evil doesn't always knock. Sometimes, it just walks in, and somewhere, in the quiet moments before sleep, when the house is still and the shadows stretch long, some people still find themselves listening for a sound they hope never comes. A creak in the floor, a whisper through the wall, a voice in the dark, because they remember what he called himself, the Boogeyman.